Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar for the State of DevOps Report. It's the 2018 Accelerate State of DevOps Report, and this year we have the role of the database in DevOps. And I'm excited that we have the opportunity to present this. It's a big step forward for me because the database is a part of the DevOps report, which I haven't seen in the past. Now, a couple of housekeeping items real quick. We are recording this, and we'll send you a link to the recording later. And then in your control panel, there is the questions pane thing that you can use to actually ask questions if you need to. So please feel free to ask questions, and we'll get to those at the end. Now, I'm Steve Jones, and I'm honored to be hosting the webinar today. I've been working with databases for now 27 years, actually, and over half my life has been spent making database applications or running infrastructure, those kinds of things. And many of you that have joined the webinar today probably know me from SQL Server Central, which I founded years ago with this kind of goal of educating you and becoming, helping you become better at your job, which is really, I think, a lot of what our main speaker today, Gene Kim, has done in his career with Dora, is trying to get us to build software. And I don't know about how Gene feels about this, but for me, I'm slightly embarrassed when I talk to people outside of this industry about the way we've built software for the last 40 years, because far too often stuff is failing. And so I'm a little bit embarrassed, but in any case, my contact information is here, so if you want to get a hold of me, please feel free. Otherwise, we have with us today the famous Gene Kim, who is, well, he's done a lot of things, and you're not just a researcher, but you're actually a coder. You wrote Tripwire a long time ago.
A long time ago, yeah, about 1991. Yeah, but what I love the most is I've been studying high-performing technology organizations for going on 20 years, and that was a journey that started when I was a technical founder and CTO of a company called Tripwire in the information security space, and it took me into the DevOps movement, which I think has just been one of the most exciting adventures I've ever been on. And I also did time as an Oracle DBA, and that was a terrible one. And I'll tell you more about like how bad I was at being a DBA, but I certainly understand the trials and tribulations and the terror that comes with making schema changes, or worse yet, when someone else makes a schema change. Right. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, Steve.
Well, thank you, Gene. And just a quick note for those of you that don't know, Gene is an author. He's written a number of books on DevOps, but he also wrote the Phoenix Project, which is kind of, I think, a great introduction to DevOps in the form of a novel. So if you haven't read that, you should check it out.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, and the DevOps Handbook was fun to write afterwards, as well as the Accelerate book with Nicole and Jez, the brains behind the State of DevOps report.
Yes. So there's some great work out there. So Redgate is sponsoring this webinar, and we're doing that because we believe in DevOps. We spent the last 6, 7, 8 years really trying to help everybody develop software for databases better. Right? We're primarily SQL Server, but we do have Oracle and MySQL tools. We have some .NET tools, but our goal is really to help you build software better. And our moniker is kind of, we build these ingeniously simple tools. But we also live DevOps. If you can see here that there's some facts about Redgate, and we build about 30 products, but we released over 1,100 times last year in 2017, and we're going to exceed that number this year. I'm on a Slack channel where I see releases, and every day some product is releasing. Most of them release once a week or more, and so we're actually living this DevOps journey as well. And then at Redgate, we believe in supporting the community. I mean, part of the reason that I'm here, when I started SQL Server Central, I wanted to educate people. Redgate continues to support that with SQL Server Central and Simple Talk, and we try to give back as much as possible. And as I mentioned, we spend a lot of time on this compliant database DevOps area where we're trying to help you get better at deploying database software. And we want you to deliver that value from the database just as quick as you would deliver it in an application. And at the same time, keep the database safe and keep your data secure and intact, because we recognize that data is a big deal. So we have kind of these 4 areas where we look at the whole compliant database DevOps thing. We want to standardize your development. We certainly want to automate things as much as possible. But not just in development, we want to make sure that we are instrumenting and having metrics about how the system is working. So we have monitoring available, and then we want to make sure we protect and preserve data, and especially in this area of GDPR and the California Privacy Act and other legislation, we have to protect the data. It's becoming very important. So with that, Gene, let me turn it over to you, and let's talk about the State of DevOps report.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if we can go forward 2 slides for just a moment, the State of DevOps report. I've had the privilege of just to go to the next slide, and then I'll come back for a second.
Okay.
Sorry.
All the way to here.
next, yeah, there we go. Yeah, so the Accelerated State of DevOps started in 2012, and I've been working with Jez Humble and Dr. Nicole Forsgren on the study going into the 5th year, and I'm so excited because it is a cross-population study that really tries to understand what does high performance look like, and what are the specific behaviors, cultural norms, architectural practices that lead to high performance. And so I don't think what makes it so gratifying to me is that we've never been able to understand, explain better than now, how we create high performance. And so I'll be sharing in the next 35 minutes the key findings of year 5 of the State of DevOps report that we did in conjunction with Google Cloud. I'd love to talk about a little bit about the database frame of this. We can go to the previous slide, Steve.
All right.
And just to articulate, I love the phrase, at the heart of every data center is a database. So what data centers look like has changed over the decades, but at the core of it, right, is still data. And how does it feel like, right? It's like, but to me, it feels like whenever the organization says we are here, and on the next build, and it says this is where we want to be, who's in our way? Who's constipating the flow of work? Impeding all our goals, dreams, and aspirations? And it's the DBAs, right? And I think that's a very uncomfortable place to be, because it says that we're in the flow of every major stream of work, right? And we are, when we make changes, it's a global change that could potentially take out every service all at the same time. And so I think this shows the criticality of databases. And I think until very recently, it's been one of the more impoverished areas, right? It spends the most amount of money, but if you take a look at the technical practice and the tools, they were not very I think primitive compared to what you would find in development and later operations. So I'm so glad to see this incredibly vibrant ecosystem of tools being created to support the DBAs. So let's talk about the key themes of the findings. Steve, on
one more.
Yep, yes, sir. All right, so one of the things that we have, there's a new construct called software delivery and operational performance. So this is, we had the throughput axis, which is deployment frequency and deployment lead time. We had the reliability axis, which is change success rate and mean time to repair. And now there's a new one that really measures about the services available to meet the needs of customers, right? In other words, you could be very quick to market and you could be very quick to repair things, but if it's never there when customers need it, well, clearly that's not sufficient. So there's a new construct called SDO, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. On the next slide, we have a new set of technical practices that we looked at. So again, the key predictors are architectural practices, technical practices, and cultural norms. So in addition to things like version control and continuous integration, continuous delivery, we have monitoring and observability. We have continuous testing. We have the technical practices around the database, and things like shifting left on security. So these are new instruments and new things that we added to the survey, and we have amazing findings around. And by the way, Steve, I have to imagine you have some thoughts that database technical practices do indeed matter.
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, I think your order is wrong here. The database should be at the top of this list because it is at the center of everything, and often if the database doesn't work, nothing works. So yeah, I'm glad it's finally in the report.
All right, and boy, did it make a splash on the next, and we'll talk about more about that later. And we looked at other cultural norms and cultural predictors. We looked at new constructs in terms of how culture influences or predicts a sense of autonomy among teams and trust in the system and in leadership, and the notion of creating a culture of continuous learning and what can cause that feeling to go up. So that's super. It's one of my favorite areas of the study. So on the next slide, this is what we inside the team we call the boom stats. And this is because it really shows the reward of being a high performer. So year over year, we always publish these out, and these are the 4 key metrics of what makes high performance great. We know that high performers are doing 46 times more frequent deployments. That could be deployments of code, deployments of changes to the environment, and deployments of changes to the database. Secondly, we know that they can complete those changes 2,500 times faster. So how quickly can we go from changes being put into version control, through integration, through testing, through deployment, so that customers are actually getting value? 3 orders of magnitude faster. We know that when things go wrong, high performers can fix those issues 2,500 times faster. Again, 3 orders of magnitude. So that's on the order of 1 hour or less versus a week or more. And when high performers do deployments, they're 7 times more likely to have those succeed without causing a step one outage, service impairment, security breach, compliance failure, massive episode of unplanned work. And Steve, I imagine like when we say that high performers are able to go faster and be more reliable, I imagine that resonates with your own experience as well.
Absolutely. From a database side of things, certainly I like features going out. I appreciate them, but because of the responsibility of keeping data intact, to me, those last two items are the more important metrics. And in a lot of the jobs I've had, I think those are the bigger impact items for us because every time we go down, everything is disrupted in the company, as opposed to just getting new features out, which may allow us to grow. The other one just completely stops us. So I really like the fact that we recover faster, and I think that's a huge impact.
Fantastic. On the next slide, we can have actually many people asked what have been the year-over-year trends in terms of high performers versus non-high performers. And so in this year's report, we actually show in a nice visual representation, the differences year over year. So that's really nice. And why don't we go to the next slide and the one that says elite performers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think what is really interesting to me is the composition of the distribution of high performers versus not high performers. It used to be the case that something like 1/5 of organizations were high performers, and that number has grown over the years to the point where this year high performers represent nearly a half of the population, which is astounding to me, right? So I think one could have made an argument. I'm not sure if it's valid, but it could be argued that you didn't have to be great, right? Because no one was great, right? Or very few were great. Now half the organizations fit the high performing cluster, right? So it says that just being mediocre is actually very, very dangerous, right? Because high performers are such a big percentage of the population, and so we're now looking at a subset of the high performers, which we call the elite performers. And so one of my favorite phrases came from the Software Engineering Institute that was told to me almost 15 years ago. It said the high performers are always accelerating away from the herd. The best are always getting better. And that is absolutely the case. And I think what is also just to punctuate again is that the need to be a high performer is growing because soon the high performers will be average, right? What was great 5 years ago is maybe no longer sufficient. Steve, does that resonate with you?
That does. And do you think that the companies that move to be high performers, obviously you want to constantly getting better, but do you think that they steady a little bit as a high performer, or do they need to chase the elites, or is elites kind of a domain issue, right? Like you have a specific issue like Google that really very few people have.
I think the efficiency and effectiveness of the technology value stream is the competitive differentiator. And so if you don't have great technical practices and great performance across all those things, you are no longer competitive. So in order to win in the marketplace, you have to be beating your competition. So I don't think anyone can be complacent that now that they've reached high performance.
They continue to improve. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. On the next slide is another one of my favorite. In fact, this is actually what I refer to the most these days, and not so much the boom stats. It just shows what high performance looks like in the specific measures. So we know that deployment frequency, high performers deploy on demand multiple times per day. So in other words, like your slide alluded to, there are teams that are able to deploy when they want to. And if that means multiple times a day, they can do it multiple times a day. Whereas low performers, are now deploying between weekly and monthly. So the notion of a quarterly deployment, right, is like that's definitely not even in the at the median of low performance. Lead time for changes. How quickly can we go from something in version control to running in production? High performers decisively 1 hour or less, whereas lower performers might be weeks, months, or quarters, right? By the time you're talking 6 months, that's quarters. Change failure rate, high performers are batting 0 to 15%, whereas low performers are between 45 and 60%. Mean time to restore. High performers can restore service to the satisfaction of the customers in 1 hour or less, whereas low performers might take somewhere between 1 week and 1 month. So I think that's almost laughable. I think some people might even say they're in disbelief about that. But especially when it comes to the database, I can think of so many times when things go wrong. The service may be up, but you are still in crisis mode, trying to restore data, trying to get things running, like it was, and returning, just trying to get back to normal operations. Steve, does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I had a story we talked earlier, but I used to work at a nuclear plant, and I ran the databases and network systems there, and we had to deploy an application on January 1st at midnight because of federal regulation. And when we deployed it, the database actually tipped over. It was actually the early version of SQL Server on OS/2, and so it wouldn't run. And we actually had to fall back to manual work because we were recording radiation measurements, and so we had to hire people. They had to record this stuff while we were scrambling to get the application working, and the database would go up and down every day. And so when it was up, people were using it and they were manually entering data in, and then it was down, they were just manually scribing on paper. So it was this huge fiasco that lasted weeks. I mean, it was over a month. So we didn't have service restored for months, even though the business could run.
Right. And like we were talking about the Phoenix project, recovering from that point of sale deployment, right? They were doing database edits and database corrections for weeks. So,
right.
Yeah.
And that's a huge impact to your business, right?
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, right, that's the 100-hour weeks, not just one week, right, but weeks at a time, just to try to get back to some semblance of normal operations. So anyway, hopefully you find this to be as useful as I do.
Yeah. So one other quick thing. So you on the multiple deploys per day, it's on demand. One of the things I always stress to people when we talk database DevOps is it's not that you need to deploy your database every day, but you need to deploy when you need to deploy. And the example I give is we have a company that builds HR software internally. And so they really deploy once a year because that's when regulations change and they have to deploy things. But then they realize that they didn't do something correctly or there's a bug. And so for weeks afterwards, they have to deploy constantly, right? And then they'll hit March and then they'll really stop deploying until the next January. But the on-demand thing is really the key here. It's not that you have to deploy many times a day, but you have to deploy when you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't say anything better than that. Exactly right.
All right. So the cloud.
The cloud. Well, this is super interesting, right? So just to show you the kind of interesting finding around this, we asked, do you use cloud, or to what extent? And then we asked, to what extent does your cloud usage fit this criteria? And this actually comes from NIST. You can get it on-demand self-service. There's broad network access. There's resource pooling, rapid elasticity, measured service, which is actually the NIST definition of cloud. And so only 1/5 of the people who answered they were using cloud were actually using it in a manner that NIST would actually call, real cloud usage. But what was really interesting is that those teams that were elite performers were 23 times more likely, to be using cloud. Sorry, the other way around. So it just shows that there's something about the cloud and the usage model that really lends itself to the practices that lead to high performance. So that's neat. And the next slide. This is so interesting about open source. So open source is highly correlated with high SDO performance, and teams that use open source software are 1.7 times more likely to be elite performers. So nearly twice as likely to be elite performers. And the same teams are also 1.5 times more likely to expand their use of open source in the future. One of my best mental models of this is Dr. Topur Badapal, who helped create the DevOps movement at Capital One. So they have 8,000 engineers, which includes the DBAs. And they have a philosophy now of cloud first and open source first. And it's interesting in what Topur will be talking about is like one of the early collaborators in the rebellion that led to this engineering transformation at Capital One was a DBA. And and when you ask, well, what would cause you to go cold calling lawyers inside of Capital One trying to find someone to help figure out how do you overcome the legal hurdles, and he described the frustration of manually patching ODBC drivers in the middle of the night, getting things running, submitting that patch to the vendor, and then only to discover in the next release they actually wiped out all of his patches, and he had to do it all over again at 3 in the morning. Right? And this
Yeah.
led to a feeling that he just never wanted to be dependent on that particular database vendor again, and that drove him to open source. And so, I think there are many paths open source, but I think the key, another key driver is that of the software we run in production, we probably wrote 10% of it. The rest are using open source components, whether it's from Maven Central, NPM, and so forth. So, open source is a critical productivity enabler. Does that, your thoughts on that, Steve?
Yes. So it's interesting you say that because I think most people that run open source don't patch it themselves, right? They don't really make changes. I think certainly some do, but most don't. But do you think it's because that open source is more flexible, that people can pick whichever tool they like or whichever library suits them rather than having to adjust their development or application to suit some other tool?
Yeah, I think it's both. There's kind of two hypotheses in there, and I personally believe both of them. One is that in an engineering culture, you're not stuck with the standardized tool chain from 15 years ago, right? You can
Right.
be liberated from that and pick the best of breed tools and the best of breed platforms and so forth. And I think the second one is they recognize that that actually helps them. It's not just about unshackling from the past. It is about being able to use the best of the best memory valley key store, the best databases out there, the best configurators, and if it's not out there, they'll build it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's fair. We're not open source at Redgate, but we do, as we showed earlier, we release constantly. We try to adapt to what customers are doing. As a matter of fact, in our monitoring software, we have two different teams that work in parallel on different sections, but they each release every other week. So every week they're kind of, they do some research for a week and build stuff, and then they test the next week, and then it releases. So
Yep.
we're trying to be close to that flexible model as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was very satisfying to see open source in the study this year. On the next slide, we have industry doesn't matter. So just to share a story, this is very meaningful and impactful to me. In my early days of studying high performers, it was always interesting to see the excuses people give on why they couldn't be a high performer. The telcos would say, we don't need to be a high performer because we're not a bank. The banks would say, we don't need to be a high performer because we're not in I was saying financial insurance. Insurance company would say we don't need to be a high performer because we're not a telco, right? And so this kind of very circular logic. And so for many years we've been able to show that high performance can be found in every industry, but that wasn't good enough for Dr. Nicole Forsgren. This time she actually did this comprehensive analysis to show that there is no correlation between industry or anything around performance. So I would call that very decisive. So very satisfying.
Right.
Next slide. Oh, here we go. The databases. Right. So we found decisively for the first time, we actually included databases in the State of DevOps report. And what we found was that, yes, integrating technical practice, cultural norms, treating DBAs as we would every other part of the value stream does increase performance. And so every breakthrough that we've seen in terms of how we do modern software delivery in the application, on servers, on platforms, and networking, right? Those are as applicable to the database as well. So everything that we learned about configuration management, on automation, on monitoring, observability, and tight team dynamics, shifting left, all those things apply. And thank goodness, because on the next slide, I think the best way to articulate how important this is this one fact that came out of the State of DevOps report, I think 3 years ago, and it was this, is that you can predict almost every metric we've talked about and every technical practice and cultural norm by asking one very simple question, which is on the next slide. On a scale of 1 to 7, to what degree do we fear doing deployments? 1 is we have no fear at all, we just did one. 7 is we have existential fear of doing deployments. And that's why in our ideal, if we could wave a magic wand, we would do a deployment never again. We're done with doing deployments. And I think because of the nature of database changes, because of its global nature, because it's irreversible, they're one-way transformations on data that often you can't transform them back. It's
Right.
making changes to databases is extremely scary. I still resist doing schema changes. just because I fear them so much. So, Steve, I have to imagine this is like what you've lived with for decades.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of these things that we talk about in DevOps, I've been doing for decades. They're really kind of good fundamental development practices, right? Whether you're building a car or you're building software. And back in 2000, I worked at this company where we decided we were going to release every single week. And back in the early days of just getting e-commerce going on the internet, and so the application developers and me in the database, we had to release every Wednesday. And initially it was, we definitely feared deployments. We were worried about it. And there would be six of us in a room at 10 o'clock at night trying to, you know, cobble together all this web stuff and this database stuff and send it out. And across months, we decided we didn't want to do that, and we got better. And it got to the point where it was like a one command release for me and a one command release from the app guy. And we would be at home on our phones for 5 minutes and we would release it, we would smoke test it and go, we're good. And then shortly after, I went to a large company. I actually went to JD Edwards, which is a large ERP company, and they were terrified of doing deployments to the production infrastructure. And they're not even customer-based stuff. A lot of it was internal. And we would spend weeks getting ready to do an update to, ERP software or CRM software or something. And it was crazy how much time we spent. So I think that the database is inherently critical to you moving faster. And so I have to ask also, why did it take so long to add this to the DevOps report?
Great question. I'm gonna pause for 10 seconds while I try to come up with a worthy answer of that. Um,
Yeah, well, think
it
about
was
it.
been on the list for a long time, and I'm just so glad that we got it in. I mean,
Yeah,
because,
yeah. No, I am too. I mean, it's what's done is done, and I'm glad it's there. I think I talked to Jez Humble years ago at some conference, and he had done the continuous delivery book with Mr. Farley, and their database treatment in there was so minor, and I was kind of like, this is tough.
actually, the planning and execution of the state of DevOps report, and we carry around a backlog of ideas, and for weeks we
Yeah,
argue about what gets in, but finally it's in, and so
yeah.
that's what probably means it's gonna stay in.
Right, right. No, and I'm glad, and I'm glad it's there because now I think there's some evidence for lots of developers and infrastructure people to say we've got to do better with the database. Just even preventing simple things like deploying the change to the wrong server can be fixed by just building a lightweight DevOps process that allows you to deploy code, in a consistent manner. That's really what we try at Redgate. We want you to do repeatable, reliable deployments, just like the application developers do, because I think, you application developers are amazing. You've done some incredible work to advance our industry, and the database needs to catch up.
And what's so great is the patterns are the same: versioning, right? Automation,
Yeah,
monitoring. So then even the way that we structure teams. In fact, that goes to the next slide, which is about testing. We've always known that testing is important, right? You can't get high deployments, through relying on change approvals, right? That reliance is going to come through automated testing. And so again, that's a decisive factor in performance. There's again, validation that continuous testing practices are required and contribute to SDO performance. By the way, I still think one of the most delightful findings to come out of this is, the notion that testing is not the job of the QA department. In fact, one of the contraindicators of performance was, is who's responsible for the acceptance test library and maintaining it. And if they answered the QA department, that was just like like change approvals, external advisory boards, right? Its performance went down. And so instead, really, testing has to be owned by development as just another aspect of delivering software. And so the same thing, applies, with database, right? It's like our ability to migrate software into production, includes, how do we do it safely, on the database. I love that. By the way, it's just a little story. One of my favorite phrases in the DevOps handbook came from a mentor of mine, Elizabeth Hendrickson, and she said there was the Los Altos workshop for software testing. So they, 60 workshops in the 2000s, and one of the exercises they did was, what was the dev test ratio for your best and worst project? And it turns out, for people's worst projects, there was always a very high dev QA ratio, right? Often like 1 to 1, right? And when they asked what was the dev test ratio for your best project, there was this answer that kept on coming up over and over again, and that was no testers. And so these are the best testers in the game, the best QA thinkers and doers in the game. And I think for Elizabeth Henderson, her aha moment was that if it's the job of somebody else, when everybody knows that there's no one else out there who's going to find your problems, then you become very, very good at software quality, right? When you know that it has to be your job because there's no one else out there. And I think, I think we're going to see the same type of things happening, not just in QA, but security and probably for the database as well.
Yeah, yeah. And as a matter of fact, I could say that we have some customers that use some of our products, and we have some testing things. And they're primarily data warehouse people that are, they're developing these systems that are at the center of lots of connections from other places. But the ones that we've got that are really high performers that are able to deploy software very quickly, and they almost never have complaints from their customers. I've talked to them, and they say they write between 4 and 10 times as much test code as application code. So they know that once we've deployed a change in the database, we've run an import process, we're done. And so they're like, it has to work. So they write a ton of test code, and they are super high performers. On the other hand, I find plenty of people that don't test well that struggle. Right. And it's interesting, Gene. So do you think testing is super hard? And my context here is that last year at DevOps East, I went to speak, and I was the only database guy, which was disappointing. But in any case, there's 1,000 or so people there, and they had an expo, and 90% of the vendors, it had to be 18 out of 20 or 19 out of 20 vendors, were testing vendors of all sorts, selling testing software. And so is testing one of those areas where we're just still very immature, we're struggling with, or is it just we haven't got the knowledge out there?
I think the practices are well known, but I think how we make testable software is definitely more difficult. I mean, I've had my own recent learnings on this. I've moved into, for the last couple of years, I've been loving Clojure, right? It's this functional Lisp-like programming language, and it's all immutable. So it's the most difficult thing I've ever learned. But it's been the best thing I've ever learned in terms of programming. I think 90% of my errors have just gone away. And one of the side effects is that I'm being forced to write much more testable code because things are ideally immutable. You can't mutate state. You have pure functions, right? And pure functions are easier to test because they don't have any side affecting changes.
Right.
And so those are fundamentally more testable, where, as opposed to,
right.
We were joking before, right? You build mocks and fixtures and facades, right? And I'm not exactly, I've done that, but I'm not exactly sure what you're testing.
Right.
Like, when you do that.
I've seen that too, where with the application developer build mocks so that they don't spend time calling the database, which makes sense. I understand some of that. But then the database developers don't test the database either, and so we get these problems. And as a matter of fact, we had I work with I do talking on some of the unit testing in databases, and the guy that I've presented with a few times, Sebastian Main, he started writing a test suite for SQL Server because he had a customer that found they had deployed this like discount program in their sales item,
oh no.
and they had deployed it for like 8 years with incorrect calculations, and an audit found that they had incorrectly calculated things, and so they actually had a tax implication because nobody had tested the database code that actually returned the discount correctly.
Interesting.
Yeah,
You're kind of nerding out here. So, and was the calculation like in a stored procedure, or was that in the application code?
it was in a stored procedure. Well, was that? I think it was actually a query that was kind of returning discounts.
Yeah.
So it in one side it was doing it one way, another side was doing it another way, because the requirements sometimes when you do things like it's this percentage on this quantity, you have a discontinuity perhaps, right? And you have to decide is it when it's equals or less than or equals or just less than, right? And so it was years later that they finally discovered it, and it didn't affect him, but he just thought, wow, this is an area we should be doing a better job of testing. We should test the database code.
By the way, I'm going to send you a link. I'm going to post it as soon as I find this. But it was this wonderful talk about like how they actually made their software more testable because they went from a situation where state mutation and database queries were happening all throughout the code, right? So that means
Right,
you have to mock and test every component, and they moved it to where they moved to a purely functional code, and all the database queries moved to one area, so you can
right,
test that one area, right? And then you have assurance that that works, and then all the calculations are in pure function form, and you can test those separately. And I thought that was just I understand it like 80%, but I know there's
yeah,
something very important there philosophically, and it just comes to mind as you're describing kind of like how should one have tested so that you could have assurance of you're communicating with the database correctly and you have confidence in the calculations.
right. No, you should do that. And there's another great. It's actually a 2-hour user group presentation. I think it's refactoring in 2 minutes. I'll post it on my blog for everybody. But these guys actually show how they refactor an application. It's not databases, but because they have unit tests running, they do all their work in like 2 minutes. So they do a thing in 2 minutes, and then you see, did I actually change the functional nature of what I'm doing? And so they're constantly refactoring, and then it's in a way that smooths out the project over time. And it's mocked up, but it's actually based on a real project. I know the guys, and so they're like, "This is exactly what we did, right? We just had to, rewrite the code for this presentation." So testing is huge. I'm such an advocate of testing.
Awesome. This is great fun. Hey, I apologize to the audience that we're nerding out on this, and I just posted this wonderful talk from Clotre in Europe. All right.
All right, let's
Next
go on.
slide. Looking into our systems. One of the goals was to look at both monitoring and this kind of observing, this kind of nascent space called observability. And Nicole goes to lengths to point out that they kind of load together, meaning that there's really no differentiator between how they're being treated as sort of like one thing. In other words, they go up and down together. It's kind of like caveman understanding. But anyway, regardless of whether you distinguish monitoring and observability as distinct, you are 1.3 times more likely to be a elite performer if you do that. And in my mind, this is obvious, right? It's like when you are deploying and when you are fixing things, it helps to see what you're doing, right? So
Right,
you can't
right,
do that without monitoring.
right.
um,
And I think for us, because we do monitoring as well, but we find we're starting to get these companies that are moving faster that want more than just understanding resource usage, blocking, bottlenecks, that kind of stuff. They're actually wanting to get more detailed instrumentation into how software is being used. And I think that's an important part of the DevOps, because how do I know what to work on or how to improve things if I don't know if they're being used or how, right?
yes, absolutely, right. And you can't deploy. My claim is, intuition is, you can't deploy safely if you can't get immediate feedback on, to get better or worse in production. So absolutely.
Yeah.
Next slide is yes. So the notion of availability is now treated distinctly as a performance measure. Talk a little bit about that. Next slide.
All right.
Culture and learning. So, well, these are some of my favorite diagrams in the Accelerate book. So this is called a structural equation model diagram. And so whenever you see diagrams like this, it says that wherever you see an arrow, it implies it shows causality. So yes, of course, correlation doesn't mean causation, but the way that these analyses are done actually are specific causation tests, and so that's really exciting. And so uh, the finding here is that having retrospectives, the notion of something, as a part of daily work, we have specific rituals to talk about what went wrong, process improvement. That does lead to better performance. And there's a Western organizational typology model, which we integrated into the survey for many years. The notion of pathological cultures where information is hidden and messengers of bad news are shot. There's bureaucratic cultures that, the cultures create um, a merciful culture, and then there's generative cultures, which are high trust. Messengers of bad news are trained to tell bad news. New information is actively sought. Retrospectives improve organizational culture and create a sense of a climate for learning. So that's super exciting. I love the phrase. the way we, in dynamic learning organizations, the way we win in the marketplace is to outlearn the competition, right? So, stuff like this absolutely matters. Oh, by the way, I mean, Steve, it's always great to be a part of an organization that makes it safe to talk about problems, that encourages learning. I think we've both lived in situations where that was not the case.
Oh, absolutely. I've got horror stories, but I got to say now, Redgate, the highest praise I give the CEO, my boss, is that he's built a company that is the company I would build if I was doing it. Where we do talk about culture, and this is when we talk with clients that try to implement database stuff. This is the hardest part. Like the tooling is easy. This is super hard.
Yes, yes. So yeah, one of my favorite topics. And on the next slide, there's two other leadership culture instruments that emerged as predictive. One is a notion that, let's see if I get these arrows right. The sense of giving teams autonomy improves two measures. One is voice. Am I heard? Do I feel like my concerns are valued by the organization? And trust. To what degree do I trust the systems that I have to operate in and the leadership systems, and positions of authority, which feed into improve organizational culture as defined by the Western model. So I love that because what does the opposite feel like? It's that I I am not heard. I am powerless to change the systems. I don't have trust that the systems care about me, or that the process we put in place improve outcomes. Right? I mean, I think those lead to terrible things, right? Including burnout, a sense of self-isolation, a sense of hopelessness. Can even cause clinical issues. So I think it is a powerful finding that there are things within our control that can improve trust and voice, and that is absolutely linked to organizational culture. Does that resonate with you? Those words kind of sound very fluffy, but
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. Like, I'm a big fan of autonomy, and we really do that. I think sometimes we go too far at Redgate, but I think it's a good trade-off. The concern sometimes to me is that we have to have a good vision of where we're going, because the problem I find with engineers, especially young engineers, is that they want to engineer stuff very well, and they forget about delivery of stuff. And so there's a balance here of letting you work in a way that makes sense and having you be able to voice your concerns or your ideas or those things, but also you have to keep moving forward too. So
yeah.
I think this is always a challenge. And like I said, this culture stuff is the trickiest part of trying to become a better performing organization.
In fact, by the way, there's one of the people presenting at the DevOps Enterprise Conference that I've been running for 5 years now. There's a incredibly brilliant researcher named Dr. Christina Maslach, who has made a lifelong study of employee engagement, burnout, areas of work-life study, and she'll be presenting on her research, which is often concentrated in areas like healthcare, customer support. But I think it is so impactful for the work that we do as well. So for anyone interested in this, we're going to have one of the best experts in the domain speaking at DevOps Enterprise in Las Vegas in a couple of weeks. So.
Yeah, so I wish I could go. Maybe next year.
It'll be the best one yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next slide. This is interesting. On Misguided Performers, we had debates about the name, but this is super interesting. There is just like we had a subset of high performers called elite performers, the 7% of the 48%. There's actually an interesting population within the low performers that have the following characteristics. They have a very low deployment frequency. They have extremely high deployment lead times, and they have a low deployment failure rate, but they also have the highest mean time to restore service, like 1 to 6 months. And so the hypothesis here is that there are a group of people who are optimizing for caution, but it actually has this unexpected, maybe to them, right, side effect that actually leads to worse outages than ever. So it's like we are doing things slower and we're actually messing things up worse. And so the theory behind this is that the hypothesis is that they're actually queuing up more and more changes, and they're testing them ever more rigorously, and they have high, they have high change success rates, but when things go wrong, they go wrong spectacularly, right? So I think kind of the modern treatment of this is that in general, right, the goal is not to do things less frequently. We need to do them more frequently with more rigor, with more automated testing, with more telemetry, and we just get really, really good at it. And that is actually the more promising approach. So, again, that's kind of speculation on our part, but maybe this might resonate with your own observations in the field, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I don't know if there's the book Database Refactoring by Pramod Saldej. Have you seen that?
Well, I actually have it on my shelf. I haven't read it, but it's
Yeah,
interesting to
so
mention it.
it's fantastic because Pramod, he talks about domains of problems for refactoring, and they're the same problems that we all deal with. But what's interesting with him is he talks about that we should be decoupling these and using time as a factor in making changes. So rather than large batch changes like let's do a column split from 1 to 2 right now, and let's add 2 columns, let's delete a column after we move the data. He said you should do that across time. So you should add 2 columns and they should exist for some period of time. And then months later, you delete that old column. So we try not to large batch changes. We try to do small batch changes and use time to our advantage in the database world, because everything we do in the database is marching forward, right? It's all evolutionary. Chronology of changes matters. So rather than try to batch those, let's spread them out. And I think every time I've tried to get all this stuff into one deployment, I've had some failure somewhere.
Right. In fact, one of the most astonishing things in when we were co-authoring the DevOps handbook was, these kind of new patterns like that, right? Where they just seem so, they seem crazy to me, right? Because it was so different than the way I was trained, right? At or the Eric Ries and the Lean Startup company, InView, they would often, instead of making database schema changes, they would just add the column or whatever. Instead of modifying column or removing column, they would leave it there and just change the application code because that was
Right.
safer, right?
Yeah.
And it left the riskiest part, untouched. And so you ended up with denormalized data,
Yeah.
which just seemed
Yeah.
irresponsible. But
Yeah.
yet, boy, it certainly makes sense to me now.
Right, right. No, it is. If you stop and think about it, it does make sense. But we have a lot of fear-based work in our industry, and I think this is
Right.
this is an example of what that causes.
Oh,
So
just another little. That's so fun. I've actually even gotten in the habit of like not ever removing data, just marking it as like ignore it, or
right,
just appending different appending things, so
right.
that I never actually delete things because I'm so afraid of. I just
Yeah.
I
Of
feel
course,
better when I don't delete things.
of course. Now you have to worry about that, right? With GDPR and other things,
Oh,
old
that's
data
true.
is a liability.
That's
Right?
right.
So now we're in a whole different spot. Like we've got a customer that works in law enforcement, and they're like, we want to delete old data because if we ever had a breach, not only do we have to notify current customers, but we have this liability with old customers for really no reason.
Oh,
You
I
know?
love that. And the Phoenix Factory says like PII, those sort of data, it is like toxic waste. It's like if you can get rid of it, get rid of it. There's no.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. All right.
Awesome. And we're on the home stretch here. Next
Yeah,
slide is
outsource.
this is great. So this is so interesting because it says that low performers are nearly 4 times more likely to functionally outsource teams than the elite performers, meaning the outsource dev in one place, maybe outsource QA to another place, the ops to another place, and then they'll maybe even rotate them around every couple of years, right? That's kind of like
Yeah,
a known worst practices and still sometimes used in certain industries. Elite teams rarely adopt functional outsourcing. They may move, not to say that they may not offshore and put the entire value stream in one place, and then that works. But what you can't do is like put these barriers behind teams that must work together. And the reason why I think this is interesting for the database practitioners is that often the DBAs are so disconnected from everybody else, they might as well be outsourced, and it just shows that every outcome measure goes the worst, and it goes the wrong way.
absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of those things that you've got to get the database, whether it's the infrastructure side or the development side, embedded with the application people and with the operations people, because everything we do has a side effect or an impact, and so we all should understand what those are and work together to minimize those. So
Oh,
I
here's
completely agree.
I meant to tell you, so I had a friend, he worked on a cloud service, and they had to. Their general manager went on Good Morning America on Thursday, 48 hours away, and they realized they had to scale throughput by 1,000x.
Yeah.
And it's like, here's what they have to do to get there, right? And one of the major learnings when they did the retrospective was, after that crisis was, if we could have waved a magic wand, we just would have loved that DBA to be in the team. It was like,
Right.
and this person wouldn't have to do any work. They would just pair with us and just help us understand the indexing strategy and like just tell us why
Right.
certain queries are slow. And in my mind, that's a great job, right? It's like I don't have to take an action item. I just coach and help.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what DBA should do. You should be coaching application developers and help them get better. Don't
Yeah,
yell at them. Get them better. So,
exactly. So this is a great
all right.
feature. So download the full report at this URL. It's over 80 pages. It is, I think, one of the best reports to date. It's just, you always think that, is there's going to be new findings this year? It's always an anxiety. This year, best yet, without a doubt. It's one of my favorite projects and something I'm just so proud to be associated with. On the next slide, here are the collaborators that make the State of DevOps report possible: Dr. Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and myself. And it couldn't be possible without all the help from the sponsors. Our dominant sponsor and partner was Google Cloud. And thank you to Redgate for helping make this happen. Couldn't do it without the help of this entire ecosystem. So with that, that concludes the major discoveries and findings from the 2018 Accelerated State of DevOps report.
All right. Thank you very much, Gene. And just to reiterate with Redgate, right, that we believe in this DevOps stuff. It's whether you've been doing it for a long time and calling it something else, or whether you're just curious about it. I really think it helps you build better software overall, and that's ultimately the goal: is to build better software and deliver it to customers. And so, a lot of our work, we're aligning our products and trying to help you do this in the database world with, coordinated database development in the team side, whether that's with application developers or just strict database developers, and certainly lots of automation that really gives you repeatability and reliability and lowering your risk. And then, of course, we want to make sure that you remember after you've delivered it, you have to understand how it performs, how well it works, what are the effects, and then all throughout this process, you have to preserve and protect data, especially if you have sensitive data. Anything PII, anything financial, medical, all sorts of areas now we're finding we've done a poor job of handling data as database professionals, and we'd like you to improve that. So that's certainly an area that I'm passionate about. We want to move forward. So I know if you've got questions, please ask them in the control panel. Gene, there are a couple I want to ask you. So somebody was asking, when we had that great grid of the elite, high, low, medium performers and the how often they deploy, how often they fail, that kind of thing. Somebody asked, over what time period are you measuring that? How does the survey actually work?
Oh yeah, so I'm even kind of visually in my head. There's each one of those correspond to a question, and I think the time units are deployed. Like in the case of deployment frequency, do it on demand. Once per day, once per week. Between once a day and once a week, between once a week and once a month, between once a month and 6 months, and so forth. So that's
So it's responses to the questions. Yeah. So if you download the report, I think that you'll actually get pinged next year to be a part of the survey again, because I've done it for a number of years. I've responded to the survey, so you should certainly do that. Somebody else asked, how do you deal with supporting numerous open source products if you're using them as part of your development? Have you found that to be a challenge, or is it easy?
Oh my gosh. Great question. I mean, I think the exemplars of this are Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. I mean, just they in general, they have one version of each library allowed, right? And maybe two, right? They have N and then N+1, and that does for each library you have an owner, right? And they're responsible for migrating everybody to the next version. You can't deprecate it until everyone's migrated, right? So there's a very vested interest. So contrast that to a friend of mine. He said, I'm at a large bank, and of the 93 versions of Java struts, we're running 92 of them in production. Right? And so just imagine all the organizational drag that's created by having to support and maintain and patch 92 versions. In fact, arguably, we're running every version except for the version we're supposed to be running, right? So I think it's very difficult, but the value. A friend of mine, Sam Guckenheimer at Microsoft, who oversees the Visual Studio Team Services project, he said we did an internal benchmark at Microsoft, 60,000 engineers. We counted how many XML parsers do we have, and the answer was like 300.
Yeah,
With
yeah.
one standard, 300 libraries. Why? So I think there's a. I'm sorry. One other little factoid, just to show you how important I think this problem is. I think there's a hidden economic cost of using open source that is rarely acknowledged. And a group of researchers, they looked at 400 open source libraries. They scanned their repos for 100 days, and they found for every day, for every dependency it took, there was a 6.8% chance of a breaking change. It
Right.
just
Yeah.
says, like,
Yeah.
this explains why it's so hard to patch, because when you do, you break things.
Well, that's where I think that like the testing, having automated testing libraries that can reevaluate things, not just functional things, but just, breaking changes, in integration is important because you want to be able, just like you want to be able to deploy features for your customer, I need to be able to update libraries.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if you've looked at the rugged DevOps, the DevSec guys
Oh,
at
of
all,
course.
Gene,
Yes,
but
yes, yes.
those guys have found that some huge percentage, like 80% of the places where we've had breaches, or because somebody hasn't patched an open source library.
Yep.
They're running something from 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, 10 years ago because they're afraid to upgrade it. And I think you have to call that out to management and say, this is a huge risk item for us. We have to be able to deploy. So,
Absolutely. In fact, last little factoid on this is that Jeremy Long, he wrote the OWASP dependency check tool, and his guidance now is don't focus on patching, focus on staying current. Right.
right.
The best countermeasure is there has to be some way to reserve time for updating your dependencies as part of daily work. Otherwise, you're going to miss things. And so I thought that was just a fascinating observation.
Yeah, I agree. Especially in this area of security issues, you have to be able to patch if you need to. You can't just keep delaying it. So practice it. So
Absolutely.
let me finish off one last question, Gene. I want to talk because I wanted your thoughts. I've got a few customers that they hate this DevOps thing. They think it encourages recklessness and poor database design because modeling and design can be important in databases. So how do you push back in there? What do you say to them from the DevOps side of things? Why is this better?
I would tell the story. In fact, there was a friend. He was the chief architect at GE Capital, and he was describing to me how the way to work, how security should work with the development teams. They should attend their weekly, demos, and give advice there. And at first I thought this was preposterous because it was so informal, right? But I think what was so convincing to me was that when you have security and legal and compliance showing up to these, development team iteration demos, and they're giving advice like, oh, hey, do you know that if you keep this PII, you're suddenly in scope with PCI and all these things, and if you really want to do that, we can help, and we have these internal capabilities to monitor and blah blah blah, right, and segment and so forth. But those type of interactions look more like interactions between colleagues and friends, as opposed to the high ceremony things where you're trying to get them to sign in blood that they did all the right things, and then we're going to test the crap out of it and see if we gotcha, right? We found something that you didn't do. I think you end up with far better outcomes, when you have those kind of collaborative, collegial interactions. And I would say to DBAs, the analog is, instead of blaming people and yelling at them because they didn't do something right, instead be that internal coach, the internal consultant to help them, right? And it changes the nature of the work, and I think in
Yeah.
a better way. You're moving accountability to the teams that actually do, deploying the changes, which is great, and you get relied less on the work that you do, but for the knowledge that you have, right? And I think that's a fabulous thing, and I think that changes so. It changes the interactions, and I think it changes how people value you. And even if people are moving to microservices and they have domain-driven design and internal databases, that means database expertise is even more needed. Right?
Yeah.
Is that too cavalier?
No, I think it's perfect because the saying that I've used for probably the last couple of years when talking about problems is that I've got enough problems. I don't really want to hear about your problems. I want you to bring me solutions. And so for the database people out there, you should take that view like don't bring somebody else your problems. If they need to make a change or they're trying to add functionality, help them find a solution. Be positive and move forward. Don't just complain or be difficult. And DevOps doesn't mean that we randomly make schema changes every day. We still think about modeling, right? Think about the implications, but try to find a solution rather than discuss a problem. And I try to do that myself. My wife tells me, stop finding problems, just solve it. And I'm like, okay, I got to do that.
And the note I would put that on is like the best days for database people are ahead of us, not behind us. I mean, there
Right.
is more data. The consequences of getting it wrong are getting higher, and that expertise is needed more than ever.
Yeah. So with that, there's one last one. There's a guy that says a SharePoint site that booked something has been down for 2 days. Do you want to rate their DevOps performance there, Gene?
That slide could be very helpful. Just time how long it takes to restore.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful talking to you, and it's been my honor, and I hope to shake your hand in person someday. And
I'm looking forward to it. No, thank you. This was a real treat.
You're welcome. And if you want to get in touch with us at Redgate, we're sponsoring it about any of our tooling or how we can help you with databases, please feel free. And then please go download the Accelerate 2018 State of DevOps report and read through it. And with that, thanks everybody for joining. You'll get a link to the recording. And thanks again, Gene.
Hey, thank you, Steve, and the team at Redgate. Cheers.
Cheers.